Welcome to the Industrial IoT Spotlight, your number one spot for insight from industrial IoT thought leaders who are transforming businesses today. With your host, Eric Walenza.
Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Eric Walenza, CEO of IoT ONE, the consultancy that helps companies create value from data to accelerate growth. And our guest today is Gil Mayron, CEO of Cobot Nation. Cobot Nation delivers full-service automation solutions from engineering to installation to training and support. In this talk, we discuss the process for designing custom automation systems for sophisticated requirements. And we also explored the strengths and weaknesses of cobots relative to traditional robots. If you find these conversations valuable, please leave us a comment and a 5-star review. And if you'd like to share your company's story or recommend a speaker, please email us at team@iotone.com. Finally, if you have an IoT research, strategy, or training initiative that you'd like to discuss, you can email me directly at erik.walenza@iotone.com. Thank you. Gil, thank you for joining us on the podcast today. You've got a very interesting business, and I've got to say, an interestingly designed business. I really love your website. I could tell that there's some personality behind the company here. Maybe we could start with your story, because I think you have quite an interesting backstory coming from kind of innovation in 3D printing, now moving into cobots. Where would it make sense to start? Where did you start engaging, maybe even before cobots, in manufacturing technology?
So in 2011, I sold what was called the first consumer 3D printer company. So it was the first 3D printer that was small enough. That was, I think, under $2,000 at the time. I don't really remember too much, but it was fully assembled, and we did quite well with it, and well enough to the point that 3D Systems acquired the company. At the time, 3D Systems was the largest publicly traded company out there. I'm not sure where they are today. They're still one of the largest, no doubt. And then from there, when my acquisition was over, the 3-year term of it, or maybe I was there for closer to 4 years. After that, I left 3D Systems. I went over to become the chief marketing officer for a company called Graphene 3D Labs. They were working on conductive materials for 3D printing. And then I left there. I sat on a few boards, moved my family over to Las Vegas, and fast forward to today. The reason why I got into 3D printing is a very similar reason as to why we got into automation and robotics. And out of that, it just so happens that we have cobots as well. In 3D printing, everything is inherently slow. And so one of the only things that you can do, aside from trying to come up with a new 3D print method, which would be quite difficult, would be to try to find little areas where you can save a second, save a minute. In order to do that, automation could potentially play a large part. So that is what got me into automation, was in order to try to speed up something on 3D printing. But in doing so, we saw a lot of similarities in where 3D printing was when I did that company back then, and in where cobots and automation, where that is today. Back in the day with 3D printing, when we got into the consumer realm, the industrial patents were expiring on some core processes. And the same thing is happening now with the cobots as well, where we see a lot of the industrial patents that are starting to become a little bit on their last days. And also with cobots, the current cobot that is out there, the main cobot from Universal Robots, that was started by a gentleman in the Netherlands, I believe, through a PhD project.
Okay, and so what does the market for cobots look like today? So I know that there's Universal, there's, maybe you can remind me of the name, I think one recently went bankrupt. I'm here in Shanghai, so I know that there's also a lot of quite generic integrators who will basically kind of, buy the components and integrate them together, but maybe don't have the expertise in the software. What does the market look like today in terms of the leaders and then maybe the more commodity robots?
So first off, I think everybody has it wrong. For all of the people that we deal with, all the customers we deal with, many of them did go to many of the other companies, some of them you mentioned. And unfortunately, what we see these days is that when somebody gets a cobot, if they're just buying it like a commodity, chances are they're never going to get that thing up and running. The amount of knowledge that you need to have, the amount of expertise you need to have on the design, engineering, mechanical side is huge. And unfortunately, I think these companies do a disservice to the public when they're trying to market these machines as so easy to use, so easy to program when it is quite far from the case. And then secondly, these are also machines where, yes, they can run against humans, no doubt. But at the same time, it's not really like that's something you want to do, especially when you're marketing these out to manufacturing companies where they're taking their core processes, ones that do affect their projections, and they're putting in these machines. So they need to make sure these things are perfect. So the way that we handle things at our company, at Cobot Nation, is we hire all of our engineers full time. Our engineers handle the projects. Our engineers install the projects. And we also maintain every install that we do 24/7. We give a 24/7 support package. And so we do things the other companies don't do and they can't do. We do not deal with resellers, distributors, or integrators. We find them to be too localized. They can't scale to the way that we need to scale. And also our customers are some of the largest in the world where they do need scale, and we have the service to offer them that.
Okay, this would be a good time to discuss in a bit more detail what does it look like to deploy a cobot. So you mentioned that it can be more complicated than maybe a lot of the manufacturing marketing teams make it look in terms of integrating this into a production process. So what would be the main steps to make sure that, even from selecting the right equipment and software through the integration, and then also, I suppose, integrating this not just into the system architecture, but also into the production processes and maybe rethinking how the process should run for the tool to be effective?
So over here at Cobot Nation, we do a lot of the software completely from scratch, depending on what it is and the kind of robot that we're doing. Many of the robots that we make, and again, I say robot because cobots is one avenue. And when somebody is looking for automation, we go with the ones that make the most sense. So not one that has a lot of theatrics, but one that makes the most sense for that company, which is typically on the throughput side as well. But going back to Cobot, when deploying a Cobot, there's a few things we need to take into consideration. So first is, what is the application that we want it to do, right? So is this doing CNC machine tending, or is this doing something a little bit more intricate? Do we need vision? Do we need to take weight into consideration? Do we need to take the length of whatever it is that they're doing into consideration? So all that stuff plays a part, which is another reason why it's extremely difficult for an individual to deploy it by themselves. But at the same time, you also have other things that come into play as well. The environment that the cobot is going into. Like you said before, are there certain things like some point of sale stuff that we're going to be patching into the cobot so it has some sort of a timing scenario with it? So there's a lot of things that we can do there. But as far as deploying, yeah, we at our company, we go before we do an install. While everything is working at our facility, we will go ahead and send somebody over to the install place in order to do a facility check, everything that needs to be done, and then they will go ahead and schedule for other individuals to come out and do the install.
Okay, great. Maybe we can take a step back and look a little bit more broadly at the cobot market today. So let's say we could look at this from different perspectives. Let's start with the market, who's using these. So I know that you're focused on manufacturing. There's also been a lot of, let's say, pilot projects at least done around the service area, healthcare, and so forth. How do you view the market today in terms of on the manufacturing side? Who's actually using these? Is it large corporates? Is it medium-sized corporates? Are there particular industries that find the most value? And then if we look outside of manufacturing, are there other markets where you either see a strong uptick in adoption or where you see strong potential that maybe hasn't been realized yet?
Sure. So we certainly see that companies, manufacturers, large and small, are definitely taking much more of a path forward within the company. So they definitely have mandates in order to move forward with automation. Regardless of anything, I think that the initial stage from some of the other companies on what they did was they marketed this out to the largest demographic that they could, and they marketed it in a way that they thought would resonate with them in the best way possible. Unfortunately, that did not help them with installs because they didn't get many done. But at the same time, in regards to the kind of markets, yeah, manufacturing as a whole is by far the one that we are concentrating on. As far as some other markets like hospitality, right? So we see burger flippers, pancake flippers, pizza makers, all that kind of stuff. But aside from hospitality, manufacturing really is the main driver for anything. And all the other gimmicky type stuff is going to come up. But that is pretty much exactly what it is.
Yeah, right. And sometimes a good gimmick is it has its own value in some businesses, but
it has to have value to it. So, for example, if I'm making a fully automated pizza place, I would expect for that to be made pretty quickly, faster than what a human would do. I would expect to have more customization options. And I would expect for that pizza to be perfect exactly the same every single time.
So just using that as an example, I know there was kind of a famous example of a pizza company that burned a couple $100 million of money and it obviously did not do those things. But do you see examples of cobots, or is the technology sufficiently mature to manufacture these types of much, let's say, messier processes than a traditional manufacturing plant, or do you feel like adoption in those industries is still some years and maybe some technical improvements away?
Well, I think adoption as a whole for everything, whether it's hospitality, manufacturing, or anything, is very close by. We see companies that are accelerating their timelines for capital equipment buys, which is what this falls into. And then, of course, because of that, you will see a lot of other things spin off. And because we've seen certain things in hospitality as well, you will see that as well. So I think the adoption is happening quite fast. We're probably, I don't want to give a guess on how many years or months, but I think it's going to be a lot faster specifically than whatever we saw in 3D printing.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's a much less significant process change than 3D printing, right? 3D printing requires really rethinking how production's done. If we look at the adoption drivers, then, I mean, I suppose one certainly that's top of mind for everybody in the U.S. right now are kind of rising wages and the difficulty of finding skilled labor for manufacturers. So that's got to be one. Aside from that, what are the big reasons that you find manufacturers prioritize in increasing investment in automation and in cobots specifically?
So there's two main reasons, and none of these reasons have to do with money, because the monetary value of this is insignificant when it comes down to what it's doing in return. So when it's taking away the potential of one application where you might have 10 or 20 people, and even if you had 5 people on it, and now you have a few cobots on it, or whatever the case may be, that will pay for itself in a rather short period of time. But once it's done, you don't have the payroll and other things to think about, and certain insurance and all that kind of stuff. But the two main factors that we notice are, first and foremost, throughput. A company that brings on automation, they want to know they can do equal or better than what the human does. They want to know that it can be extremely consistent. And then lastly, the other main driver is going to be safety. So because you have humans doing certain jobs, you have wear and tear, and then of course you have the random safety issues that come up. But those are the two main adoption drivers that we see.
And then actually going back to this discussion of industry. So if we're looking at those adoption drivers, maybe, safety being one where there's in some industries significant safety concerns and others less so. What are the industries where you see the most adoption today?
It depends. We're seeing it pretty much across the board. So there's not one main industry that said, "Oh my goodness, we're going to automate," and then it's across the board. It's in absolutely everything, and we're dealing with companies that are on land, that are under the water, that are on the sea, pretty much just everything.
If you look at something like, so I guess automotive was probably the first industry to really start adopting this in mass. Do you see a lot of standardization in terms of where they're used in processes? So is it that there's fairly quickly becomes best practices of cobots can be used in this particular process in an automotive production line? Or is there kind of a lot of experimentation, and each each manufacturer looks at unique issues and kind of doesn't try to adhere to standards or best practices, but just tries to determine what makes sense for them? How do you see this discussion going when you're looking at where a cobot could fit into a plant?
Over here at Cobot Nation, we deal with the largest automotive companies in the US specifically. What I can tell you is that they 100% are not ready as far as standard cobot scenarios. They're still very much in a ideation phase as to where they should be putting the cobots. And I think they're also realizing that it's not just a scenario where you put something next to a person and suddenly it just works. It really is a scenario where we start to do full automation and get rid of the humans completely.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So why is that the case? Because I think a lot of people assume that it would be, you're replacing 10 people with 3 cobots and then 2 people that are working with those cobots. So why is it 100% automation?
Well, what usually happens is, and again, it's phased, but what usually happens is you bring a cobot to do something, and unless the job cannot be done via, a gantry system, cobot, whatever the case may be, then obviously you do need a person there. And that typically would fall into the category of things beyond vision. So things beyond a typical camera and sensing and stuff like that. But we see very few of that in manufacturing. A lot of stuff in manufacturing. So if you're assembling a box, there's no thought there. And so the entire thing in time will be completely automated. When you're dealing with a car, you have certain processes there where you do need to have people, but you have other processes where you just don't need to have them anymore. So somebody who's sitting and splicing certain wires, they probably don't need to be doing that for the rest of their lives.
Okay, I understand. So it's more about defining the areas in the process that can be automated and focused on those. And then there's going to be other areas in the process that require kind of the human flexibility.
Once we get automation into to any one of the companies that we deal with, it's always what can we do next? And then it's always, well, what else can we do to continue to optimize? So it's really everybody has the best intentions when they start with automation, but at the end of the day, they want to see how far they can push it.
Yeah, it makes sense because you have this dynamic where automation provides standardization and you want standardization going into that and you want it coming out. So once you have one part of the process that's highly standardized, ideally you want the inputs into that process also being standardized, and then you start looking at how you can extend the automation upstream and downstream from that starting point. Let's then talk a bit about the equipment itself and differentiation. So at a high level, you have hardware, software, services. And then on the hardware side, I suppose you have the servos and you have the camera systems and so forth. How do you think about defining the right solution for a particular problem in terms of what mix of hardware, software, service is going to be a best fit?
Sure. So every time we have somebody, a customer who inquires that they have a new application, we'll send somebody out, we'll take a look, and then we'll start to ideate on solutions. But what dictates the solution are the core goals that the customer is trying to achieve. So that could be that they just don't want a human there and they don't care about speed or anything, and fine, no problem. But most of the time, they do care about all of that stuff. They're manufacturers. They definitely want to see the throughput stay the same or go faster. Most of the time, it's go faster. And then what that does is it increases margins and things like that, right? But that typically would be the way that we go about it. The kind of things that we make for the customers. So we will do, if a cobot is right for that application, or if the customer really just wants a cobot for theatrics or whatever the case may be, then we'll absolutely build around it and we'll make it happen, no problem, if it can fall within the specs of the standard cobots that we have. Otherwise, if it doesn't fall into the specs, or we're not able to achieve their goals with a cobot, then we absolutely will move on into another type of automation method. So over here at Cobot Nation, we make everything from scratch. We do all the software, everything. So it gives us a lot of freedom to do certain things. So we can make a gantry system. We can do things at a very high speed. We can keep things extremely controlled. We could put a dashboard for the customers so they can see things on a tablet or phone or whatever in real time, anywhere in the world. So there's a lot of things that we can do once we know what it is that we need to do.
That's interesting that you build everything from scratch as well. So do you have for the core components, I saw Cognex, for example, on your website as a machine vision solution provider, but do you have a set of, especially on the robotic side of kind of preferred partners or vendors, or?
We work exclusively with SMC Pneumatics, so they're one of the largest component manufacturers in the world. With that, we also work exclusively with Cognex in regards to vision. If there's anything else that we need to make, we make it ourselves. And that's pretty much the way that we go. So those are the main vendors that we have. On top of that, we also use HP multi-jet fusion 3D printers. Those are the only printers, in our opinion, that compare against injection mold quality and quantity. But that would pretty much be it.
Okay, got it. Yeah, makes sense. And then on the hardware side, for the capabilities of the equipment, my understanding is that a cobot can, what is it, like 10 kg or something starts to be a limit, and then beyond that, you're looking at more of a traditional robot. Where are the systems today in terms of their capability for a load?
Yeah, so again, and it depends. I mean, weight is just one factor. You have a lot of other factors that come into to play on whether or not somebody could use a cobot for their automation. But yeah, today you have 10 kgs. I think you have a few companies that came out with either 13 or 15 kgs. And again, I think that they're pushing the envelope a little too far. These start to become major issues when you put them into a facility and you have people walking around. You're still putting gates. You're still putting things there that you would do on industrial robots. I would caution those companies to continue down that road. I don't think that it merits a collaborative robot definition when it gets a little too heavy with what they're doing. And a 22 pound or a 10 kg item, that's a heavy item. So that would hurt.
Yeah, and so is the issue there is that there becomes a bit too much momentum because of the weight of the item, so that you don't have the so much control around stopping the robot if there's somebody in proximity, or
I
what?
mean, it's just everything. The fact of the matter is that you're taking a product that's 10 kg. And that alone is a very, very dangerous scenario, depending on exactly what's happening. You probably have conveyors that are bringing it to you, and then you have a cobot doing something. And we'll say this. So one of the reasons why we do a launch from scratch over here is because we want to have full control over everything that happens. And so what we noticed with some of the other companies, yes, they have these things where if you walk into the cobot, you're not going to get hurt, but the chances are is that somebody's not walking in to a cobot. Chances are is that they're hitting it without knowing, or something's happening, or and that's not a good thing. And just because the cobot stops doesn't mean that it did any sort of good in that situation. So we would caution when we have customers that get up to that weight. And again, keep in mind, 10 kg, that's the maximum weight that you want to put on there. It doesn't mean that the robot's going to be moving fast at all. So we're very careful of that. And we would always recommend if somebody was getting up to the limit there, maybe we want to look at some other solutions. And most of the time, the other solutions tend to be cheaper, lower cost than the typical cobot.
So maybe now we can turn to building the business case, and I think this point around cobot versus other solutions is maybe a good point to consider here. We've already touched on this a little bit, right? You have labor cost, you have quality, you have safety, et cetera. So you have all these kind of some very hard components of the business case, some that are a bit more qualitative. What does a business case usually look like for you when you're developing this for a customer?
Sure. Can you define that a little bit more, because a business case could be pretty broad here.
If a customer comes to you and says, "Okay, we have a problem and we think you might have a solution for it, and before we make the investment, we want to know, how much money is it going to be in terms of capex, how much it's going to be in terms of opex, and then what are you going to save in terms of labor, in terms of increased throughput, et cetera."
So we have a method of going about bringing on new customers. So first off, from the day that they inquire, they will talk directly with an engineer. They're not going to be talking with a salesperson. That engineer is going to find out what the application is. If they need to go do an onsite, which is pretty much almost 100% of the time, they will fly out. They will walk through a facility. They will gather up all the information they need on every single application that they can point out. And then they'll come back to Las Vegas, beautiful Las Vegas, where we are. And they will go ahead and put together a workflow for the specific application that the customer is starting with. If they're not going to start with other applications, we're not going to put together the workflow there yet. We can give them some estimations, but it's not going to happen. But a typical workflow in regards to an application, so that will include everything that we need to show the customer that not only do we understand what the application is, but the solution is here, and that they understand that the solution is possible. It makes sense to everybody all across the board. So in the workflow, we will include certain types of text in there, some information pertaining to their application, probably some math as well. But most importantly, we include there exactly all the components that we're going to be installing for the customer. We'll put a floor plan. And then we'll get that over to the customer, and then we will see if there's anything else that they need. So many times they'll come back and they say, "Hey, you know what? I kind of want to see this in some CAD." Well, and we'll whip up some 3D CAD and we'll get it over to them, no problem. But that's pretty much it. But with that, we also give the quote, and we also give an ROI report, so a return on investment report. The ROI report that we give, we'll give it in an Excel spreadsheet so the customer could go in and edit it the way that they want. And then the quote is the quote. That's pretty much it. From that point on, they can discuss it internally. We'll probably review everything with them. But from that point on, we're pretty much good to go until they get us a purchase order.
Okay, well, let's dig into those 2 points a little bit more deeply. So for the ROI, what is a typical range? What would you consider good, and what's kind of borderline for making the decision?
Sure. So with automation, with the stuff that we do, the ROIs typically range from anywhere from 6 months to about 18 months, depending on what it is. The average first application quote that we do, all in, including our 24/7 support and everything, is typically somewhere in the range of about 50,000 to maybe 110,000.
Gotcha. And so that would be for one system?
One cell, yeah, one manufacturing cell for the application, right? So one automated application, or partially automated, but it would be for one application, right? That could be CNC machine tending, it could be painting, polishing, it could be sorting, could be anything, yeah.
And then if we look at that, the quote, I guess you have some flexibility in terms of, or the manufacturer has some flexibility in terms of how they pay, right? So it could be heavily CapEx.
We have a specific way of having the customers pay. So for a customer, even if they're a repeat customer, if it's a new application, we do 10% down. We will go ahead and build everything at our facility here in Las Vegas. So we call our facility the Collaboratory, so Cobot and Laboratory. And in here, we house the full customer manufacturing line. So actually in front of me, I see an overhead conveyor. That was given to us by one customer where we're automating a few different parts of it. And then once we're ready, they can fly out, they can see a video in real time, they can approve it, and then we'll go ahead and break it down and put it out there for installation. But the reason why we do it like this is because we're dealing with some of the largest customers, and we want to make sure, first off, we do the right thing in regards to security, but they're of the mindset where they want to automate a little bit more than just one application. If they're going to roll this out across hundreds of facilities or be it something like that. So
yeah, well, I was looking more at total cost of ownership. So you have your CapEx, and then you have this kind of maybe software, SaaS, service fees.
So with new customers, 10% down. Once the, let's call it prototype, is approved, at that point, we'll ask for 40%. So we're at 50% total there. And then the only other time that we'll ask for the last 50% is once everything is installed, working, everybody has been trained. And then at that point, we'll invoice out for the last 50%. Now, if it's an application that we're doing for the second time or hundreds of times, at that point, it's just 50% down, 50% upon completion, which is no big deal. And then we go from there. So we work with CapEx probably in the best way possible, more so than any other company out there. Many other companies would never do this with 10% down. The fact that we do CAD before we even take any money in is a testament to what we do.
And then you mentioned earlier that you also provide long-term services. That you just have a SLA going forward. Is that a common situation?
So basically, yeah, for the support plan, it's $4,599. Doesn't matter what it is that we're making. That is every 3 years. And that's the only thing that continues on every 3 years.
Good. Well, maybe we can break down a case. It would be great to walk through kind of how you evaluated this. So if we can be as specific as possible, you're welcome to anonymize the customer's name. But if you have a case in mind, that'd be great to give us a kind of a detailed walkthrough. And also just discussing who on the customer side you are engaging with in terms of who's the buyer, who's working with you on defining the requirements, and then maybe who are the users on the customer side who's going to be kind of managing or maintaining the solution from their side going forward. I think that stakeholder perspective is important here as well.
So typically with what we do, because it's something that's quite innovative to the companies that we work with, they usually have somebody a little bit more senior. Maybe when we go out for a facility tour, it might be the plant manager, something like that. But usually it's somebody a little more senior on the engineering side that the company trusts to bring on new activities, right? And this person will typically see it through all the way through to installation. At that point, maybe they'll put somebody else on it in order to keep it some sort of a shared support type thing. But that's typically the way that it goes about. So engineers, plant managers, but rarely will we see anything else, anybody else than that. Owners, we get a lot of owners, but then they typically will refer it over to some of their lead people. One example that I could give you in regards to a recent installation that we did for a very large company is for pipe swaging. So what that means is they take these pipes, they put them into a machine called a swager, and this machine has a bunch of dies inside, and these dies will pound the end of the pipe. And they might turn it into, some circular shape at the end, but that is what they do. And they do it all day long. They typically have somebody sitting very close to the floor. They're taking these pipes, which have very sharp ends, and they're putting it into the machine, and then they're throwing them into a pile, and then they're doing it again with another one. They're pretty much going from hand to hand. It's very dangerous. It's extremely cumbersome on the shoulders and other places of the body as well, certainly the back, lower back. So it made a lot of sense for them to bring on a robot. So with that, we did use a Cobot, but we built a lot of systems around it in order to deal with certain things. So first off, you have pressure that happens. You have force that happens when you're putting something into a machine. A Cobot may not always be able to do it. But at the same time, the most important thing with these people was that not only could we get the job done right, not only is it consistent forever, but at the same time, we had to surpass throughput numbers. So it just depends on what the scenario is, but that would probably be a pretty good example.
And the timeline here, what does it look like from ideation through installation?
Sure. So first off, everybody is different depending on how much we're automating. If it's one application, from the time we get a purchase order, if we're working on it immediately, you're probably looking at anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks, depending on if we need to order certain things, if we need to machine certain things. And then, of course, we typically like to take at least 5 business days to test after we've programmed everything, just to make sure everything is going well.
Okay, great. Interesting. Last question from my side, and maybe there's some other things that you'd like to discuss as well, but this is still, I would say, a relatively young technology. So what about the future excites you here? Where do you see room for significant improvement in future generations of cobots?
Sure. So what excites us is the ability to push the adoption forward in automation. We're excited that we are the ones that are also doing it as well. And so we think there's a very large open market out there of an immense amount of applications in which they just haven't automated, and usually that's because they're not getting really consistent results. First off, from their own people, and then secondly, they're not sure as to what the result would be from a cobot as well. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen, but there's a lot of opportunity out there. We think that we will see the adoption happen a lot faster than we've seen anywhere else, and we're very excited to see how that goes.
Okay, so it sounds like you feel like it's the technology is more or less mature, but it's more moving from pilot, and educating, and then defining the right use cases, and so it's more of an education issue as opposed to continuing to mature the technology.
100%. Just like in 3D printing in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, it's all about education, educating the public. And from that point, it makes it a little bit easier to get the sale done. But if they're not educated, then good luck. That's a really long sales process.
Yeah, understood. Great. Well, anything else that you wanted to touch on today?
No, Eric, I think those were great questions. And I thought that was fantastic. Thank you.
So then I guess really the last thing here, how can folks get in touch with you?
Sure. So I can be reached first off through any method through my company. If anybody goes to the website, cobotnation.com, something will get to me if it needs to get to me. LinkedIn is a really good way to get in touch with me. And those are pretty much the two main ways that I put out there.
Okay, excellent. Then Gil, thanks for your time today. Appreciate it.
Eric, thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning into another edition of the IoT Spotlight podcast. If you find these conversations valuable, please leave us a comment and a 5-star review. And if you'd like to share your company's story or recommend a speaker, please email us at team@iotone.com. Finally, if you have an IoT research, strategy, or training initiative that you would like to discuss, you can email me directly at erik.walenza@iotone.com. Thank you.